In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Pasternak. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I'm beginning to believe that Noodler's makes their Russian exclusives or Russian series or Russian named inks so aggressive out of some kind of hate of Russia, or the paper there is very different. If you can get Russian paper to me, I would really appreciate it. I need to really understand this more. It's really astounding. Another Russian series ink that just goes through even good fountain pen paper. The dusty tone is nice for those that like dusty purples, and the color change you're seeing as it dries is pretty cool, but goddamn, it's aggressive. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it is a light dusty purple, which is rather pleasant on the page. Now, we're not getting any kind of feathering, we're not getting any kind of spread or shading. This isn't really a purple that I go for, but I do see the appeal of it. I do think it is very pleasant to look at on the page. I just already know how this story ends, so I can't help but feel disappointed at the beginning. Looking at the zoom nib, it's quite a bit darker than the fine. Shocker there. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, although I will say, yes, I do see a few darker times happening, like on the second to third line when the G and D touch. It's a little darker. On the third line, the bottom of the F and the E in Fame are both a little bit darker, but we'll see. Looking at the music nib, I write better with the music than I do with the zoom. I really need to be able to get better at it. The only way to get better at it is to make you all watch me write with it. Probably other better ways, not really best for me. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is a very nice tone on the page that is not shading at all. I really expected if shading was going to come out that it would be this pen that would do it the best. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the music and the zoom nib both got very deep into the page, but actually, there's a ton of ghosting that's happening even on the fine. Now, none of it bled through and touched the page underneath. Thank you, Clairfontaine. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. A Sailor 1911 Large with a zoom nib. A Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get roughly the same tone that we had with the fine on the Clairfontaine. It is feathering a little bit. I kind of think it's a bit manageable, though. It is spreading just a little bit as I'm looking at them side by side. It doesn't shade, but inks typically don't shade on this paper. The slightly difference in white of the two papers, though, I don't think it looks as good here as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the zoom nib, we get a little bit darker tone than we had with the zoom on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does feather, which I really expected with as wet as this writes. It does have a little bit of spread, which I kind of expected a little bit for what I was doing here. It doesn't really shade. It's just there. Now, dusty purples aren't my thing, but this tone happening right now isn't the best one for me. Looking at the music nib, we get the same tone that we had with the zoom. Not a surprise. We get feathering, very tiny but definitely there, and you see it from the very get-go on to and his and adoring and friend. Every word has tiny feathers all over it, but I don't think those feathers are the reason to not use it. It does have a minimal amount of spread, and I think the spread is really under control, and again, not a reason to not use it. It's not shading. I'm not expecting shading generally on this paper, though. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how heavy it got into the paper. Now, it never touched the page underneath, but there is no using the back of the page, except maybe with the fine if you were to really choose to. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, this is quite a bit darker than we were getting on the Clairfontaine, possibly an effect from the color of this paper. Now, it is feathering a little bit. It is spreading just a little bit, but spread much less than I really expected. In that, I want to say that it's very much under control. I thought this was going to go nuts. It is not shading. You can still clearly see it's a nice purple on this yellow paper. Looking at the zoom nib, it is a few shades darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. Still really holding on to the fact that it's a purple ink. I like this purple that's showing up right here much better than I did on the last paper. Now, it feathers, not a surprise. It spreads, not a surprise. It doesn't shade, not a surprise, as this paper isn't made for fountain pens, and I just like to look at some of these. Looking at the music nib, we get the same tone that we had with the zoom. It does feather, and I think just a little bit less than the zoom did, but both of them are very manageable and under control. It does have a tiny bit of spread going on. Again, very manageable. If I was to, it's not a complaint of the ink, it's actually the paper. The lines are much thinner, and that's why I like unlined paper, because I feel constricted and the desire to write between those lines. I would love this paper, not for fountain pens, but unlined. Looking at the page underneath, you can see a ton of spots where it did bleed through with the zoom and a little bit with the medium. Too much bleeding for me to actually use, and when you see the back of the page, you can see why with the tremendous amount of ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, it is a little darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, but not as dark as on the last paper, but it's not as dark a tone of paper either. Now, we get a tiny bit of feathering, which is occurring, just a tiny bit, totally manageable, not too bad at all. We get a tiny bit of spread that does occur, totally manageable, doing really well. This paper tends to handle fountain pen inks much better than would be expected. No shading at all. Looking at the zoom nib, it is a lot darker than we had with the fine. It is a bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, about the same tone as that last paper. It does feather a tiny bit, kind of like the fine did, so with that it's rather impressive. There is the tiniest little bit of spread going on, but maybe I'll stop talking about it because I am on the zoom and I have to remind myself of that. I try to keep the pen fairly upright and keep it consistent. We're not getting any shading. We typically don't get it here. Looking at the music nib, we get the same tone that we had with the zoom. It is feathering, but noticeably less, and you have to actually really go searching for them to see it. On the third line on congruence, you see it a little bit on the G and on the ENCE. Okay, in subject where I backed up over the letters twice on the second line, yeah, you see it a little bit. No real spread, no shading at all, just a dusty purple. Looking at the page underneath, you see that there's a lot of spots that I circled, even with the fine nib. So it does bleed through and ruin that next page. And seeing the back of the page, you understand why, because there's an extreme amount of ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Pilot Mixable Violet. Here is Robert Oster Barossa Grape. Here is Zenzoi Purple.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get very close to the tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. Rather surprising. I kind of expected still kind of a difference because of the tone of the paper, but it didn't really do that here. Very much like the Clairfontaine. Yes, we get a tiny bit of feathering. I'm going to call it manageable. I'm not seeing any spread, though, so it's doing very well when it comes to that. I'm also not seeing any shading here, but this ink hasn't really been shading. Looking at the zoom nib, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. It's quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Dark like it was on a few of these other papers. Now, we get some feathering, and it's going to occur quite a bit. We really do see some spread going on. Again, I'm trying to hold that pen as upright as I can. That's always difficult for me to do, and if I write with it down, it is really super wide, and I need completely unlined paper in order to be able to write anything readable with that. You see how bad this is. Looking at the music nib, we get a tiny bit lighter tone than we had with the Zoom. There is some feathering. I think the feathering is better under control than it was with the Zoom. I think that the feed must be just a bit better controlled with the angle of the pen. We don't really get much for spread. We don't get anything for shading. We just get a solid dusty purple. Looking at the back of the page, we had bleed through on the Zoom and the music nib, but not the fine. And when we look at the back of the pages, we can see why there's a lot of ghosting even with the fine. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a shimmering magenta ink by Diamine, their Magenta Flash. Here is a gray ink by Krishna, their Pencil. Here is a pink ink by Robert Oster, their Cherry Blossom. Here is a yellow ink by Sailor, their Kobe number 21, Sai Sanjo. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get a darker tone than we had with the Clairfontaine. Not tons darker, just a little bit darker. Now, we get some feathering, which is very normal for this paper. We get some spread, which is very normal for this paper. On the majority, I want to say here it's doing fairly well. We're not getting any shading, but we don't normally with this paper. So as long as it doesn't bleed 9 pages down, it could be kind of good, maybe. Looking at the Zoom nib, it is a lot darker than we had with the fine. It does feather, of course. It does spread, of course. It does not shade, of course. But look at the color. Actually, I think this very dark purple that it's putting down so consistently is a very nice dark purple that as a color on its own would be very interesting to use. And I really do think I've seen it before as this ink is appearing on the page. Looking at the music nib, the tone is the same that we have with that Zoom nib. And just a comment continuing on the tone, when I say I've seen it before, I just mean the tone, not that this is a reused ink, because this kind of aggression you would recognize. Does it feather? Yes, it does. Does it spread? Yes, it does. Is it better than it was with the Zoom? Yes, it is. Is it shading? No, it is not. But we don't expect any of those things here. I know I say it every single time, and I'm going to continue because we don't need to expect it. Looking at the page underneath, it is filled with circles of where it bled through all over. And we see why when we look at the back of the page. Extreme amounts of ghosting. There's no writing back there. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The nib that is in the pen of your enemies. Perhaps Ivan Drago from Rocky is how this ink is kind of performing. It looks at paper and says, I must break you. And it does. Every time. So if I was really trying to choose a pen that I think is going to work really well for this, I would say you really need to go with a super dry, ultra extra fine to kind of control this bleeding and aggressive. This ink needs to get off the steroids because it's going to make its balls shrivel really small. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.